I'm Marissa Brown. I'm the Assistant Director for Programs here, and I am not going to get to introduce Jazz. So all I can say is we are so excited to have you here today to present your work. And as I think everyone in this room knows, this is work that Jazz has been working on for, is it a year now? Every time it's all a blur. But we have been really fortunate to have Jazzmen create an original artwork for the center that responds to the wallpaper in the center with funding from the Brown Arts Initiative. So she's a fit artist in residence here. And we're just honored and thrilled and blessed to be able to work with you. And so thanks for that. And we're excited for your work. And we will next hear about Jazz's intro. Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. So, very glad to get to do this. So, Jazzmen Lee-Johnson reimagines possibilities of the present and disturbs fixed notions of the past to conjure a future that might come to be. She is 2020 Artist Fellow at the RISD Museum. She's the inaugural Artist in Residence of Rhode Island Department of Health, where she's using the arts to confront health disparities, which I would like to know more about. She has worked with youth in Baltimore, New York City, and South Africa, and continues to mentor teens in music at New Urban Arts. She has curated exhibitions at Chinese University of Hong Kong, Artist Proof Studio, and ABSA Art Gallery in Johannesburg, South Africa. She received her BFA in Film, Animation, and Video from RISD and her MA in Public Humanities here at Brown, where, like me, she's the Fellow for the Public History of Slavery with the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Jazz is a visual artist, a scholar, a composer, and curator. Her practice centers on the interplay of animation, printmaking, music, and dance, and is informed by a yearning to understand how our current circumstance is tethered to the trauma of the past. Through her visual, sonic, and movement investigations across time and technology, she disrupts and asserts ideas of history, body, liberation, and otherness. Jazz is a queer Black woman from Baltimore and a new mom, and also is in my South African folk band, and is also my professor. Jazzmen Lee-Johnson.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. First, I just want to say thank you. My heart is filled with gratitude to share this time in this space with you. So thank you, everyone, all the forces that brought us together today. Thank you. I hate being in the podium, in the front, even though I'm a musician and a performer. I like to break up this space, and I very much so wanted to set things up today as if we were in my studio, which is why I had some music going. I have tons of just stuff, mediums, ideas that are percolating that we'll be able to hopefully all engage with at some point. And I just really want to break up this space. We were talking about what it even means to be here and to still have all this portraiture and feel to a certain extent like one student said the thumb of the Brown family is still on this house. So I felt it very important to just break up the space, make some noise, etc. So I just want to preface things with that. And I'd also just like to share that I am actually pretty hyperactive. And so this is going to be a little bit different in the sense that I might break out into song at some point. Break out into movement. I hope to awaken all of our senses from sight and sound, hearing, touching, etc. If you want to smell some materials, that's fine too. But it's just in an effort to make sure that all parts of us are engaged as we process this wallpaper, and also just this is a process right now, and I'm really excited to include y'all as part of it, so thank you. So let's get to this wallpaper. Here we are at the JMBC, where we have the views of North America My French is so-so. Moi, je parle un peu le français, mais les vues d'Amérique du Nord, otherwise called. This is a wallpaper that is not only situated here in this house, in this building, it's also at the White House, which is in the diplomatic reception room. So we could get into that. It's at the Spence School in New York. It's at the Acorn Club, which is a really prestigious, affluent, fancy space in Philadelphia. It's also in a resort in Virginia. So just to give you some context of where else you might find this wallpaper, here's the diplomatic reception room. So this wallpaper was created in the early part of the 19th century in 1834 by a French artist named Jean-Julien Detil. Again, my French, I try. And basically, what we know is that he probably, most likely, I'm pretty sure, never even stepped foot in this country. And so he created this panoramic wallpaper that were sort of these collections of ideals and romanticisms around what is now the United States. And so, yes, he designed this wallpaper. It's using a very old printmaking process with a series of wood blocks, which means they're carved out and each color is layered on individually. And what else can I say? Let's get into what the main motifs are of the wallpaper. So there are 5 motifs, really. The first, this I think is called like the view of New York Bay from New Jersey. We'll get into the details of what's in each one in a sec. This is the view of West Point Military Academy, which is in New York, and it's a really prominent military academy that trains folks in our armed services to this day in higher ranks. So this shows a group of cadets lined up as people watch and see them go over their, their exercises. This is a view of Boston Harbor. And this is the view of, well, a lot of problematic things, but supposedly the natural bridge, which is in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. So those are the 5 motifs, but I want to get into the elephant in the room. Oh, sorry, number 5, Niagara Falls. How could I forget? So as you walk through the hall, you'll see those, and some of them repeat, but those are the main sections of the wallpaper, just to give you some context. Now let's get into 2 major pieces of the wallpaper that stand out, that are an issue for many reasons. This is the first bit that you'll find at the bottom of the Shenandoah Natural Bridge section, which shows indigenous people supposedly in a performative gesturing, or basically in an exotic way, being exotified, performing for a white gaze. And it's unclear sort of which nation is represented here, and if it would be, it's not accurate, for lack of better words. And so that's one major section. And then there's this piece, which seemingly might seem like, oh, it's all right. We see that black people are dressed just as white people are dressed in the wallpaper. But the basis of this motif, this image, is actually from a series called Life in Philadelphia by the artist Edward Williams Clay, who created all these stereotypical caricatured tropes of black people and their attempts to assimilate to white culture and white affluency. So that's what we have going on. The other thing I want to say is, like, if people have questions or comments or, like, you know, even a or yeah or snap, that's fine throughout this. And so that's what we're dealing with when we're talking about the wallpaper, when we're looking at the major sort of imagery that's represented and sort of like on the backdrop of this whole thing of like the technology, the industry, the trade, et cetera, that's part or the backdrop of this country. Now I want to shift things a little bit and get a little random, but I promise I'll bring it full circle. And it's going to be very quick. Can everybody who feels like they have a little bit of rhythm, okay? I'm prefacing that. So if you don't, you can nod. But if you have rhythm, could you just snap or clap with me? There will never be a time for rhymes to stop intruding my mind. My flow's tighter than cornrows, making you press and rewind. Don't think about battling me, your style is just too weak. Like Titanic in the ocean, these flows are just too deep. There will never be a time for rhymes to stop intruding my mind. My flow's tighter than cornrows, making you press and rewind. Don't think about battling me, your style is just too weak. Like Titanic in the ocean, these flows are just too deep. So why? Why would I go into verse all of a sudden? I go into verse because I'm a hip hop head, I'm a hip hop kid, and it's really, I've come to know as an adult, even though I feel like we're post hip hop era, or at least the golden age, it's really, it's really a big part of my practice. I dance, I MC, I write, and so I want to share with you very quickly, not to get too heady or methody, but just the elements of hip hop and how they factor into how I'm approaching this wallpaper and how I've approached other things. But I also just shared that verse with you because, you know, when I was 11, I had a rap group called Bonafide, and it was me and my best friend, and we just found it as a way to like empower ourselves, to play with the language, a language that's like, as someone who's of African American descent and not necessarily connected to like a direct connection or knowledge of who my exact ancestors are, I find it so powerful that we would be forced to this country and really just flip the language and know how to like just really, excuse my French, but F with the language. And so I find it really empowering. And so the elements of hip hop being DJing, like spinning records, MCing, like I just did, b-boying, which not to like put it as a only cis male thing, but like during the break beat of a song, the DJ would repeat that beat, and there would be dancing during that beat. So b-boying being like break boys. Beatboxing, so like vocal percussion, graffiti, obvious. And then this one that like Africa Bambaataa, one of the founders of hip hop, would say is an important element, which is knowledge of self. So how does this factor into what I'm doing? I see like the breakbeat, this repetition, this loop, as sort of a part of history. We repeat cycles of history. We're always moving through time and through history. And the breakbeat is this in-between space. And there's lots of possibility in that. I see this idea of digging and chopping. A lot of hip-hop music or early hip-hop music was sampled and made into something new. There's so many aspects of history where we don't hear from those who were involved in the story, just because of those who had the means of production, just because, you know, slavery, colonialism, imperialism, genocide, et cetera. And so I find it really important to sample and also to generate something new from an old thing or a thing that is somehow connected. And then finally, this idea of remix. I think remix is amazing. And not only do we hear it in our music, in our visual culture with memes and such, but I really think it's a way to reinvent the self, or to create a sense of personhood, because you have the possibility of sort of just shifting a perspective or taking some things and putting them together to make them something new. And for me, it's sort of like a decolonizing practice, for lack of a better word. So what do we do with the views? Oh, goodness. What do we do? So with that in mind, one of the biggest aspects of hip hop for me is freestyle. Freestyle happens if we're in a circle, if we're in a cipher like this. I'm not going to ask you to freestyle, but that's what happens. That's what happens with the work that I do. That is, before I try to put any particular constraints around the research that I'm doing or whatnot, I just allow my mind to go off on tangents, and then I'll make sense of them thereafter. So here are the tangents that I came across in coming to this wallpaper for the second time. The first time I was a student, it was weird. I already felt like, oh my gosh, I'm in an academic setting. I come from an arts background. I was one of the first in my family to graduate from college. My mom and aunts followed, but I was one of the first, so I felt really, I don't know, I felt uncomfortable being here. And then to come into a space like this and see this wallpaper, even though I know that doesn't represent me, it's sort of like, again, this long history that makes me feel like, oh my gosh, can I even be here? Can I be a part of this? So in coming back again, I started to think about presencing and sort of my, what it would mean to insert blackness into the wallpaper. So some of the things that first came up before that were things like toile, which is a French tradition of textiles. It usually shows an idyllic scene or an important moment of history. It's very decorative for wallpaper, for upholstering furniture, etc. So I thought about how stories can be represented in textile. There was even a whole movement that was about travel with the toile and sort of the beginnings of sort of an outsider's gaze on someone else's culture. There was a whole balloon mania that took place when the technology developed for balloons, and this tells that story. Then I started thinking about Dutch wax print, which is seemingly quintessential African fabric, right? But even tied up in that is colonialism, is this form of fabric that was developed from seeing batik happen in Indonesia, then the Dutch sort of adapting that, and that fabric becoming too flamboyant for the Dutch, but across many trade routes and such, finding popularity amongst an African audience. So even that is tied into this history of slavery, colonialism, trade, etc. But it's amazing fabric, and it is it's African at this point. And it also tells stories, different things about culture, etc. This is thinking about the African American tradition in quilting and sort of what stories could be told in fabric. And this is an example of actually how enslaved people would use quilting as a way to tell folks, as a map, basically. So this might look like, oh, this is, it's very, what's the word, polychromatic. It's a lot going on. There's harmony within all that's going on, but actually there's a message in here. And so there's power in that, right? Same thing here, how lessons can be learned. Same thing here with the Lakota textiles. Same thing here with the Sutu textiles, these blankets which are called maholabele, mark like adulthood, mark when one is expecting, mark when someone has passed. So there's a story to these textiles, etc. Yes. So back to my forking paths. The other thing that I started, the other tangent I went off on, thinking about like technology, thinking about how indigenous people are represented in the textile, I began to think about an essay that I had read by Lisa Nakarama a long time ago about circuitry and sort of this story of Navajo textiles and how there are connections visually in the designs and the circuitry. So in many ways, like some technologies that we think are so like white or so recent actually aren't. And so I wanted to sort of tease that out a bit. In doing some more reading, I also found that in the late 70s through the 90s, a lot of the labor that was that went into making like circuit boards was done by Navajo women. So what does that say about now we're in an age of cryptocurrency and in the iCloud, and those are like our empires of finance and technology, and they're still like at the base wouldn't be here without people of color. And then the last thing I'll say, I had a paper. There's lots to think about here, but I just want to get nerdy for a second because one of my other like passions is astrophysics. And I really like thinking about time as nonlinear. I really like thinking about outer space and like planetary exile, because what are we doing on this planet? So we need to have a plan in case we need to leave. And I think it's important to know some things that are happening beyond. So with that said, I also like to get theoretical in thinking about blackness in terms of physics, as it being infinite, as a bottomless pit being a place of possibility and change. And that's something that I'd like to activate in this wallpaper. Okay, so the wallpaper. Initially, when I was approached, super excited. And basically the thought was like, hey, there's this wallpaper, you know, we think you'd have a cool perspective as an alum. Will you create a response to this? And I thought, and I was like, yes, I'll create a response. But the more that I thought about it, the more that I thought how important it was for it to be site-specific. Because if it was a response that I created and was shown somewhere and then taken down, that's it. But if the wallpaper stays, I want there to be a possibility for there to be conversation. The other thing is, if the wallpaper goes, like, what does that mean? And so this sort of being a possibility for an in-between, and it actually came up in our archiving class that in mentally preparing to not see the wallpaper anymore, this piece becomes sort of a third space because it covers it, but it somewhat reveals what's under it, but we'll like get used to the idea of not seeing it like as clearly as we have when we walk through the halls at this moment. So this is just a quick sketch of what it will become, which is a series of prints that will be, I'm pretty sure I'm going to go with the lavender. You can just pass it around because I think that sense of touch is important and it's nice to feel things. So, but these are the sort of materials that I have explored working with, and ultimately I'm using I think I'm going to go with the lavender. And they'll hang from the ceiling just in front of the wallpaper. Okay, so let me just check my time here. Good. So there's two motifs that I'd like to do, like tip my toe in sort of dive, and then like a full on, like, let's get into it. The first is the West Point Academy, military academy. So when I looked at this and I read a little bit about this, I started to think about West Point. I thought about like, okay, in terms of presencing and a black presence, there are these figures, but like what's going on here, who knows? I know that this wallpaper was 1834, which is pre-Civil War, but I know that these cadets from West Point fought in the Civil War. So I was like, okay, who is the first graduate? I want to know who the first black graduate was from West Point Military Academy. And it was this guy. Yes, yes, yes. He graduated in 1877. Yes, thank you.
I was born in the same town he was from.
Wow, amazing. So yes, yes, thank you for that. And he has an interesting story, right? He's the first, which carries a lot of weight. But he led the 10th Cavalry, and a lot of those soldiers were basically stationed westward. They were sent to go west because there was interest in further expanding, in further colonizing out west. We like ditto, I don't want to say we, but there was a lot done on the East Coast and moving towards the Midwest and the West. The 10th Cavalry was sent out to like basically fight on behalf of white people against indigenous people who were westward. And so Henry was one of those individuals who led a whole cohort of black troops. And he, what do I want to say? I want to say that he was dismissed eventually because of his relations with potentially rumored relations, romantic relations with a white woman who was the sister of a colleague. And it was said that if you basically it was improper to have any sort of romantic relationship, let alone like leveled relationship with someone outside of your race. The other thing that I would say that's interesting about him as a figure is that when he was dismissed, correct me if I'm wrong, you know a little bit about him, but that he joined the efforts of the indigenous people, especially along the Texas-Mexico border. And so I just find it extremely interesting that there's this story of slavery and colonialism and imperialism and genocide and sort of indigenous folks, black folks, who are dealing with that in so many different ways, whether it's a forced migration, which happened, you know, on this land, or the forced migration from Africa, were like black folks were put in a position to fight against indigenous folks. However, this is one particular example where and in other parts of history, that's not the case, where there's coalition building, where there are people who come together and like fight against the big C, colonialism, white supremacy, etc. But I find that all this, I guess I bring all this up to say that when we look at this wallpaper and we see black folks and white folks dressed the same, mingling, it didn't happen. Like that's not what was going on, because even beyond the time that the wallpaper was made, we had the Civil War, we had Reconstruction, we had Jim Crow, etc. I also was just like, once I did my like Wikipedia search of Henry, I also went to one of my favorite places, the American Antiquarian Society, to see what they had. And they had this album, a few of many, of like graduates from the West Point Military Academy. this 10th Cavalry that Henry led was called what we know as the Buffalo Soldiers. And they were called the Buffalo Soldiers, or the story goes that that name was given to them from the indigenous people because their hair was like buffaloes. So this is the sort of thing to bring you into my process a little bit, where it's like, I love going down rabbit holes, like finding information that's connected and not connected. And these sort of stories and this sort of imagery, you know, might make its way into what I'm doing. So here's a drawing of a buffalo. And I think there will be a buffalo in this piece. So look out for it. The other motif, this being the Jersey side, I think it's the Hudson, right? Is this the Hudson? So it's the Jersey side of the Hudson. And then this particular interaction. And then all these folks as well. There's a little close-up. There is the piece that it is modeled after, or I guess sort of adapted and remixed from, which again is a series called Life in Philadelphia. And so even though maybe it was the artist's intention to put people of color, or at least Black Americans and white people on the same level as each other in their dress, in their activities, it's not. It's a miss. And so, like, going off on this tangent, I start to think about 1834. We still have slavery, even though, like, maybe they're in New York where technically there's not the same sort of situation as what's going on in the South. There are slave codes, there are black codes, which restrict people's bodies, right? They restrict how many of you could gather out in public, which I think it was like 3 for New York. If you were down in what is now the Wall Street area, if there were more than 3 black people in a crowd together, then that's a risk and against the law. Other parts of black codes sort of dictated how much land you could own, marriage, what kind of jobs you could have, how much money you could make, etc. So I still feel like, even though this is an idealistic wallpaper, there's slavery. It's going on. It's happening. Let's talk about it. I also think about, like, fleeing slavery, and just like what the relationship would have been like. This was made, I think, in 1900. It says somewhere on here. I love looking at old, like, political illustrations and cartoons. And this just goes to show you the race relations, they were not what the wallpaper that's out there shows. And so this is, like, again, spending time at the American Antiquarian Society. Then we get a little, like, radical. Here's the side of Shakur. So here's the point where I start to go off on a tangent and think about, all right, we have the past, we have the distant past, the not so distant past, the present, and the future. And I just start to think about, like, you know, what would Assata be doing in this scene? What did it mean to, like, and when you think about relationships between black folks and white folks as represented in this wallpaper, thinking about the Black Panther movement and sort of what those relationships were like, why people felt threatened, you know, by armed black people. Like, why did they not feel threatened before when they were outnumbered? What are the nuances of that? I start to think about race relations today, like the Capitol riot, and sort of what is that about? The whole movement, white supremacy, is just about, well, it's about so many things, but it's not recognizing non-white people as human. So I think about that in this wallpaper and how that's represented or not represented. I also thought about Queen and Slim, which was a fairly recent film that came out. That's sort of a Bonnie and Clyde tale of two folks who are on a date, and then they end up in an altercation with a police officer who ends up dead, and then they're running and they're trying to reach Cuba, you know, like similar to Assata Shakur, and they don't ultimately make it, but they have quite a journey along the way. So I think about that. I think about fugitive slaves. I think about, you know, all these things. And so I want to get really quickly into some of the makings. This is also, you know, you've been sitting there with some paper. By now you might be familiar with the motif, so there's a random mix of the different motifs of the wallpaper, and you have one of them. And there's some tracing paper on top of that. But I want to begin to take you through like my process a little bit. Okay. So with all those thoughts in mind, I have to start sketching. I have to start drawing. I have to start making sense of things. And I'm just going to slowly take things away until I get blank. So sometimes that starts with the archive. The digital realm is also this third space that's pretty cool and pretty weird because, like, obviously this broadside wasn't purple and pink, but the digital realm allows for me to play with this. And so there's a combination of this sort of thing as well as drawings. So I'll start with this one. Let me take this out. So one of the things that came up for me on the wallpaper, if you have the wallpaper that has the, well, most of the wallpaper has people on horses. But if you have the wallpaper that has the motif of the Hudson River with the remix of the Life in Philadelphia image with the black folks, I thought about two things. Going back to Queen and Slim, there's a quote from that film that says, white men never trust a black man on a horse. Why is that? Because, like, he has to look up to him. And that's not, like, usually mirrored in society as often. And so one remix or thing that I'm interested in doing, and just to show you, like, the physical process, pretty sure I had this drawing. Yeah. So here's the drawing. I do a lot of layering on the light box before I get into the digital realm, but then I scan it, play with colors. There's going to be hot pink, just so you know. Be prepared. Going to brighten that place up. So this image here actually comes from, you see this, there's an individual on a horse. He's holding what kind of looks like a noose. And there's another individual here. Well, the story goes that fairly recently, there was a black man who had some mental health issues who was found just loitering at an amusement park that was closed. And there was a police officer on a horse who tied him up and escorted him to the next destination. And so, again, I think about these race relations of, like, this idealistic image of then and black people being amongst white people and this figure on the horse, and having to not correct that, but make sure to say that we're not there. That's not where we are right now. And so this is the sort of thing that like comes of remixing this. Like, what does this mean? And then one would hope, or I would hope, to then take it a further step and imagine like some sense of agency or empowerment, so that we're not always put in these like traumatic situations. And so that's an example of like how the process works in terms of going from ideas to sketches to the digital realm, layering physically, layering here. There's also layering that happens with printmaking itself. Once I have an image, I print it on acetate. I expose this acetate on a screen, and then that screen gets ink run through it. I do lots of color tests to see how different inks will mix, to see how something going from something that was hand-drawn or a remixed archive thing turns into like what it feels like once it's printed. And so how I'd like to end things today is to give you an opportunity, and maybe this is a lot of pressure, maybe this is too much to ask, but to give you an opportunity to just take a look at the motif that you have and think about what you want to say about it, what you would change about it, what you would highlight about it. There's some materials here, there's some surface here if you feel like you don't want to be sitting in your seat, but like I just offer you the opportunity to sort of imagine something else. Because I'm still very much so deep in the process, and I feel a little protective over my process. So I'm happy to share this portion of the process with you, but it is further along, and this is what I feel comfortable sharing publicly for the time being. But I hope that we can be in conversation. The plan is to have my final design by the beginning of the year and go heavy, heavy, heavy into production. We've been doing tests. I'm working with 2 other printmakers because of the scale of the piece itself. I couldn't print it alone. So we've been doing some color tests, some fabric tests, and that's sort of, I think I'll park it there because I want to definitely leave room for conversation and discussion, but thank you, and yeah. Any questions, any thoughts, queries? Yes.
Did you know William Yellowrobe, he used to be the artist in residency at Trinity?
I did not.
Well, his grandfather was a Buffalo Soldier, so he did lots of plays called Grandchildren of the Buffalo Soldier.
What is his name?
William Yellowrobe. And I was in many, many of his plays and wrote plays with him. But he just passed away probably 3 months ago.
Oh.
Actually, he met his wife at my house. And I wrote a song for their wedding. Anyways, there's a lot on Grandchildren of the Buffalo Soldiers. There's actually a book called that.
Word. Thank you. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the artist Ken Muffin?
Yes.
All right, I was just thinking about
Yes.
interventions that could happen
Yes.
with that and just like writing in.
What are your, say more. I mean, first of all, the level of skill of painting is like
Incredible.
amazing.
Incredible.
And then the actual, like, it's so, I hope to get to that level one day in my lifetime. But what does it bring up for you?
For me, I'm thinking of somebody from the West and thinking about American soldiers coming into our territories and slaughtering us. And so like there's still this kind of adding this texture, like it's not just black and white in terms of like who is who was doing the bidding for colonization. And so I think as a Native person, like I would appreciate that at least that would be teased out in terms of like what the Buffalo Soldiers actually meant to people in the plains.
Yeah, Henry fought in the Apache War and a whole bunch of others.
So that would be, I think that would be something that I would appreciate to see. And then also, like I look at the Niagara Falls, and it makes me think of like Carolyn G. Parker, who is a Seneca bead worker, and she helped preserve their beadwork and the regalia that we see today. And just like the tremendous influence that she had, and one of the reasons why Seneca beadwork became popular was because of Niagara Falls, because it became a tourist destination, and so souvenir bags were sold there specifically, but they embodied a dual signification. So I was just kind of thinking about those things, just writing in some indigenous people too. And
Yes, thank you. And I'm happy to talk more if you're open to it, because I mean, that's part of why I wanted to leave this open at the end, just to hear what folks are thinking and if there's ways to, like, what I should be thinking about more. I mean, I feel like I definitely couldn't take on the task of correcting the wallpaper, but I do feel that research is important and there is an opportunity here, and so I'd like to bring in some real perspectives, some other views that should be at the forefront.
I really loved when you were talking about textiles and the quilts, and that's something that's been an interest of mine. And the patterns and maps within the quilts, which is super common in like Virginia and South Carolina. And I was just thinking it would be so amazing to use the repetition so common in wallpaper, to use some of that imagery and some of those shapes and the geometric patterns in some way in the background that is this kind of repeating reminder of that little piece of history, and actually even using some of the native shapes and patterns as well, because that are so powerful. Like some of the ones that you showed, like there was the buffalo, there was the firebird, and there's these certain patterns that show up a lot in native textiles that are really just, we take it for granted, like this blanket, but it's got so much significance to it.
Yeah. I think you bring up a really good point, and like one thing that I struggle with is like being honest about my identity and who I am. I'm Black, and so I come to the wallpaper in a certain way. I'm an artist, so I have the power to render things, but also, and I feel some level of like, not some level, a great level of responsibility to, like, again, I can't correct the wallpaper, but to really like bring some other voices to the forefront. But one thing that I do struggle with is like I'm Black, and so that's one perspective that I bring. How do I, or is it okay for me to, or how do I ethically and thoughtfully bring in other perspectives from a culture that is not like mine.
It's not necessarily your responsibility to represent everyone who has been oppressed historically.
Of course.
However, you just have access to certain imagery. I just thought it was interesting for what you presented. But I also love like the intricacy of the you were talking about astrophysics and star maps, and things like that, and it all kind of melts together in an interesting way to me. And of course, it's going to be your purview. Like, there's no way that it's not going to be. It has to be. But I just like those concepts being part of what you're doing. But in no way am I saying like you need to make sure that.
No, I don't take it as that. And I think that even looking at the toile, even the fact that it's large, but it is a repeat. I think even thinking about conceptually, like there are cycles. We're in these cycles of history again and again and again, and how can that be visually represented? And I think like with the quilting, it is very well executed, and it's this whole language. So I totally agree with you there. I just also like that brings up for me like, you know, like, all right, well, how do I do this? Is it okay for me to do this, you know?
Just to go, you shared part of your process in the beginning, which is amazing to kind of have the privilege of seeing into an artist and how you work. But that idea, I think, of remixing and like how do you do that? How do you take those voices and how do you take things? I feel like if you haven't figured that out, you're gonna get there because you're so aware already and conscious of your own process and how remixing and all of these things with music comes into it, because in that way of time not being linear and having all these layers, I feel like music is the same way, right? It represents time in this weird way of like, it isn't just one thing, it works on many levels. So I don't know, I just kind of feel like you're getting there, like you're getting there.
Thanks. I'm trying. It's a process. I'm sorry, you had a.
Oh, yeah, okay. The vignette that you were showing of like the black people who were congregated and you were referencing the posters or the other artists. How did you figure that out, or were you just already familiar with that other work before you saw the wall?
The two that what it actually pulls from, that is thankfully, like, there has been a lot of, I think that initially there was some research done by Robert Emlin, but also just like when I was asked to do this, I'm looking at Marissa and Sabina and Ron and Dietrich, like, provided a lot of resources and essays just to get some initial information about the wallpaper and some context, and that was one of the bits of information.
How are you thinking about addition versus subtraction? Because I'm thinking about, the power of that, like, TED Talk that went viral of Titus Capar painting out the white people in that, historic painting. And I'm wondering, like, whether you've struggled or are struggling with, there's the power of addition, but there's also a certain power of subtraction.
Yeah.
And so how are you?
I am really troubled by it, and this is why I'll just bring back my title slide again. I don't know if you noticed, but so I think that that part of it is playing with, like, where are there moments in the wallpaper where I don't want any of it to be seen, and I want to put a whole other scene on top of it. Like, I don't know. I'm not sure what to do with this moment yet. Like, but this is a mode that I might use. That is, like, blacking it out, and then having new imagery on top of it. I don't know. I'm still working on it. But I think that, I love the idea of being able to see parts of it or being able to move, even if it's like, I know we're not going to slide it, but I don't mind. I'm making this in a way that I don't mind if it is touched. I think it will be totally fine to be touched and sort of for folks to be able to peek behind it. But I think that it's a hard balance that I'm working through. It's a lot.
The idea is still that basically the whole thing will be covered, which is just amazing, I think, and I think your work is absolutely fantastic, as you know, and I really look forward to seeing you go down even more rabbit holes than you've already done, which I think is a wonderful method. And I wondered, do you imagine, since we've all touched this fabric, which I think when you walk in that perspective will not be transparent, but when you stand in front of it, parts of it might be transparent, right? Is that how you imagine that will allow some glimpses, the wallpaper behind it, or do you imagine the whole thing entirely covered in color?
The way, and I can show you this really briefly, But the way that I work in printmaking even is like to get nerdy. I use a lot of transparent base in the inks, which instead of making them opaque, makes it possible for things like a blue and a yellow to overlap and make a green. So inevitably, even the the imagery that's like has a lot of ink buildup will still have a level of transparency to it. So there'll still be the ghost of the wallpaper, which is like speaks to the fact that we have these specters of history that haunt us still. So.
Are you and Brown planning to share the results with the other venues that?
Let me just put it in the universe. I want to go to the White House. I think it would be amazing.
The White House Historical Association, because the White House is our building.
Yeah.
It belongs to all of us.
That's a good point.
Yeah. No, I would love to like be the first, and then hopefully others. If the wallpaper is not going to be taken down, then at least have it be disturbed. So yeah, I think that would be awesome to like get it in that room as well.
So it's a really interesting approach to what to do, and I think the question of addition and subtraction is really interesting. I've been thinking about palimpsests a lot, but in a literary context rather than a visual context. And one of the things that seems to me to work there is there's always there's prior text, right? There's what this one part is called the hypotext, right? And then there's the text layered onto it. The text that's layered onto it has its own kind of integrity as a different story. And I wondered where your thinking was in terms of if you were just going to sort of read the layer that you're putting on, what your story is sort of, is there a way to think about it in its own terms, or is it always going to be critical so that you would need, and probably
I hear what
you need to be able to see what is behind it in order to understand what your layering is doing.
I would say no, you don't need to understand. It's sort of like if you, there's one thing to sort of embody an expression, right? If someone is sitting a certain way, you can read their posture, like, and you know how they're feeling versus if they're saying it or whatnot. What am I getting at is that I do think it could work as a standalone because a lot of things will be shown, you know. And sometimes I think the imagery is a direct, like, it might be a direct covering or remix or changing or shifting of the wallpaper. And then there are other moments where it has more to do with the echoes of the wallpaper, but it's not like tethered to it. I think it's a both and thing, like many things for me. Yeah. I'm working on it. Working it out.
Are you planning to incorporate any like auditory component with your piece?
I don't know. I mean, one thing that I love to do, like my background is in animation, and I love to dance. My mom's a dancer. I'm a dancer. I might as well claim it. And so in a lot of the work that I do, there's always like movement and gesture within the figures. And I like wonder, even in coming here today and like changing the setting of the space, I wonder if there's a way through, which I've done this before, which is an audio or a compositional, a sound compositional rendition of like the imagery. And if that like opens the possibility of like a dance party. So you can like experience it in that way. I don't know. I'm not sure yet. I have so much, there's so much to do just with what's already there. So, but yes, I always, with my work, am thinking about like it in different registers. How does it sound? How does it exist on a stage? How does it exist on a tangible like piece of paper or fabric or whatnot? I saw your hand.
So I hear, I hear you're like, I'm not done, it's not done. And I was just telling Mari here about my project and like how my process is sort of like putting a bunch of stuff together and then breaking it apart and then, sort of remixing it, destroying it, building it again. And I see like you doing a lot of that. So I guess I'm wondering, like, clearly you're in the thick of this, but like within your process, like when do you know that you're done?
That's a good question. Van Gogh, like who would have thought I'd bring him up a lot? But he had a saying that was like, I don't ever finish a piece, I just abandon it at a certain point. And I think that I get fatigued. It's a lot of processing to excavate all of this. So I think that's one part of it. And then another part of it, because I'm like an aesthetic nerd, is about composition and balance. And so, even coming from a background of editing and animating, like if I make this tweak, does the walk cycle feel different? Or if I edit this, how does the time change? And even with this sort of imagery, like, is this balanced? Do I have enough negative space? How do I feel about the colors and how the complementary colors are talking? And really, like, it just gets to a point, I think, where either I'm like so fatigued, or like I feel like there's a good visual balance. Or sometimes there's a question of like, does it say what I want it to say? Can you see my thesis? Or can I see my thesis? And then I'm like, all right, I see it. It may not be like apparent to everybody, but if it's apparent to me, then I'm okay. I'm never satisfied, but yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Also, like, I see that some folks wrote some things. You're welcome to keep them for yourselves if you'd be open to sharing, like, not in the circle, but, I'd be down to look at them, or if you want to leave them with me and put your name, I will give you your proper due. But I'm just curious to see what folks are thinking about and what's coming up for them in this. Yeah. Thank you.